If you want to understand the African American experience, especially in the first half of the 20th century, you must read Langston Hughes. And I will see to that part of your cultural development. At least you will read Cora Unashamed, and I may post some other articles, short stories for you to read. He was raised not far from here in Lawrence, Kansas, and then moved to New York and was a major voice in the Harlem Renaissance. And Langston Hughes, somebody you should definitely know. Joseph Heller. Joseph Heller himself was a bombardier in World War II. He wrote this wonderful book, Catch-22. You probably heard the expression, but you really don't know quite what it means. It, in fact, is a description of impossible conflicting propositions. The one cannot be true if the other is true. For example, in the movie and in the book, he talks about Yossarian and his quest to get out of being a bomber pilot over in the European theater. And he goes to the doctor to try to get disqualified for being crazy, but the doctor explains, I can't list you as crazy so long as you're flying, because if you're flying, you're not crazy. And he says, but I want to get out because I am crazy, but if you quit, and so it's Catch-22. The book is a magnificent examination of the terror and the boredom that typically characterizes the life of men at war. It's a wonderful cast, too. It's something you should read. Dark, historical, satirical. It talks about what the American experience was in war. J.D. Salinger, enigmatic, charismatic, reclusive. He wrote this great book, Catcher in the Rye, in 1951. And like several generations of high school students, I was required to read it. And, you know, none of us was particularly enthusiastic about reading any book in high school. But this was a book that spoke to us. It's about a young man, Holden Caulfield, who is filled with angst. He is just upset by his hormones, his social circumstance. It is a book that tells a story of teen struggle. It basically does more than that, though. It tells about our problems of adaptation to the 20th century. It is a book, if you haven't read it yet, you need to go online and buy a copy of The Catcher in the Rye and see the genius of J.D. Salinger. Like Truman Capote, this was sort of his grandest work. He did write a little after, but this is the work for which he is best known. All the King's Men is a special favorite of mine because it's a political novel. Now, while Robert Penn Warren wrote it as a novel, it was obviously patterned after the strange, megalomaniacal life of Huey Long in Louisiana. Broderick Crawford won an Academy Award for Best Actor, Oscar in 1949. This film tells the sort of populist, politician, manipulator tale of the 20th century in America. It's one that you should read, even if you have no interest in politics. Tennessee Williams. Tennessee Williams is probably most famous for his plays. They were all squalid and torrid, and these two, Streetcar Named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, both earned him Pulitzer Prizes. They were made into grand movies. In the upper left, we see Cat on a Hot Tin Roof with Maggie the Cat, played by Elizabeth Taylor, and Brick, played brilliantly by Paul Newman. At the bottom, we have the classic Vivien Leigh and Marlon Brando in the leading parts in A Streetcar Named Desire. Tennessee Williams told these tortured tales, and in some cases there were redemption, and in other cases there was not. But it's it's again an internal conflict that mirrors the external conflicts that America had during the 20th century. Sinclair Lewis. Sinclair Lewis wrote Aerosmith, Babbitt, Main Street, Elmer Gantry among his works. He was the first American to win both a Pulitzer and to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's a critical examination about American capitalism. Certainly Babbitt is, and Main Street is. Revivalism, he offers a pretty stunning critique in his Elmer Gantry. That too turned into a fine movie. Sinclair Lewis, one of those fiction writing voices of the 20th century that gives you an idea of what happened then. Thornton Wilder. Thornton Wilder wrote exclusively in the area of fiction. The Bridge of St. Louis Rey, Our Town, the play, The Skin of Our Teeth. His play, The Matchmaker, later became the Broadway musical Hollow Dolly. He was an authentic scholar who taught at the University of Chicago, later Harvard. I actually had a friend of mine back in the 1970s who was himself about 80 years old at the time, who had been in English class as a student of Thornton Wilder's. And inevitably, my friend told me, people would always ask him, because Thornton Wilder said, you never want to use the device Deus Ex Machina, the tool of the God, to explain something that happens in your work. And somebody asked him about the Bridge of St. Louis Rey, which depends on Deus Ex Machina. He said, well, there are exceptions. And he was exceptional. Arthur Miller, playwright of the first order, The Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, certainly among his best works. The Death of a Salesman is a story about Willy Loman, the guy who is a lifelong salesman whose identity is caught up in his work, who wants his sons to have success, but he's not sure he wants them to be salesmen like him. Willie, is his job. And when the salesman's lot starts going away, starts dissipating, and when these route salesmen are not so important anymore in society, Willie tries to come to terms with, what am I? Who am I? If I'm not a salesman, who is Willy Loman? Willy Loman is a salesman. And I used to always say when I would give people my business card when I was up in Chicago, this is what I do. This is not who I am. Willy Loman didn't understand that. Arthur Miller understood it. He told the story of the agony that Willie had when he told that. The Crucible, it's a famous story about the witches of Salem, except many people interpret it as his critique of the witches' hunt that the anti-communist Joe McCarthy and the others in the early 1950s and late 40s wrought on America. So his, like Rod Serling's parables, should be read both on its face for a commentary on the witches of Salem, and then for its value as a parable. Nelson Algren, he was sort of the Chicago school. He's got that gritty, harsh taste in his mouth. He's a creature of the city, and his stories read that way. This one that I feature here is The Man with the Golden Arm. The Man with the Golden Arm was not a guy whose arm was gold because he was a great violinist. He was a drug addict. And this book almost didn't become a movie because the movie production code was not going to allow a central figure who was tarnished by drug addiction. Well, it did get made into a film, a very powerful film. And Frank Sinatra, the great singer, who was also a fine actor, played this leading part opposite Kim Novak. What was Algren telling us? Algren was telling us that the stories of America are not uncomplicated stories of men and women who go to work, raise their children, go to school, and die in place. there are some men and some women who live with addictions, who choose the tortured life of the addict, or who have no choice and live the life as an addict. That's one of the values of Ahlgren. James Baldwin. James Baldwin was black, he was gay, he was a powerful voice. His Go Tell It on the Mountain, semi-autobiographical, talks about the Christian church in black America. He was a prominent activist during those days as well. You can see in this picture is Charlton Heston, Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier were all in there, but Baldwin was one of the leaders there at the Civil Rights Rally, one of the figurative leaders. This is a voice that you must hear. He must speak into your brain, either Notes of a Native Son or Go Tell It on the Mountain. Promise yourself you will read James Baldwin. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, all of you probably had to read The Great Gatsby. Gatsby, like St. Clair Lewis, wrote about capitalism. And when he wrote about, these characters in The Great Gatsby, we all assumed that because they were wealthy, they were going to be comfortable and happy in love and all of that. And Fitzgerald helps us see that the decadent life they led did not necessarily lead them to happiness. So it takes a page out of American mythology of the 20th century. To be rich is to be happy. To aspire to be rich is to take you on the path to happiness. It is, a little like Tennessee Williams, a tortured tale. And it's been made into a film a couple of times, this last time with Mia Farrow and Robert Redford many years ago. It's a terrific book to read. John Hersey, one of the great journalists of the 20th century, he wrote something that was a lot like In Cold Blood. It was nonfiction, fiction. He fused the two together. He took his journalistic tendencies and his experience in Hiroshima after the bomb and wrote a 31,000-word article. This is amazing. New Yorker on August 31st, remember just a year after the bomb, published his entire magazine because they thought it was so important that people should read this. And it's still important that people read Hiroshima by John Hersey. So, I offer you a list of 100 authors in this module. I encourage you to look at them. I hope that you will read at least 5 or more of these authors and their works before the term is over. I think this is worth doing, and I celebrate Module 9, the common foundation of fact and fiction.